So as we continue on in our sermon series, Rescued to Be God's People, we recall how God has been protecting the Israelites. Last week we learned how God provided instruction to the Israelites so that God would pass over them during the 10th plague, making them easily identifiable to God. God then leads the Israelites to the Red Sea, where he equips Moses to part the sea, the people to pass through, and then to collapse the sea upon their Egyptian pursuers. And seeing all this, we read in chapter 15 that Moses and Miriam and many of the Israelites, they then rejoiced, sang songs, and worshiped God. That's where we get our passage for today, where Moses then leads the Israelites from the Red Sea into the wilderness of Shur, which is part of the Arabian desert on the northeastern border of Egypt. Last year, right around this time, I traveled to Egypt and I journeyed on a bus through that general region. And even today, with the conveniences of modern technology and the conveniences of modern day travel, this is a very arid and dangerous place. We traveled on a tour bus with security in front and behind us, a car on each side filled with guys with automatic weapons. And you travel this way because even today the region is dangerous. There are fundamentalist groups in those regions that every once in a while like to try and make a political statement out of some unsuspecting tourists. It's a long trip. There isn't much along the highway, just a couple of gas stations for tourists to stock up on junk food along the way. And that's even traveling at modern speeds. The Israelites were traveling on foot or by caravan. Even today, that would be a brutal trip. So they've just gone from this ultimate high of being freed from enslavement, overcoming their oppressor, to the flip opposite of feeling oppressed by their freedom because their basic needs aren't being met. So when they come to this place, Marah, they find water, and the place is called Marah because the water's bitter. It's undrinkable. And the Lord then instructs Moses how to make it drinkable. And then God says this really important thing afterwards. And I'm paraphrasing, but God says, if you will listen carefully to my voice and do what's right and do what I teach you, I won't bring you any trouble. For I am the Lord who heals you. And right after God says this, then they arrive at Elim, where there's what we'd call an oasis, a fertile spot in the desert where water is found. And in this case, there's 12 springs and 70 palm trees. And those numbers are likely God's hat tip to the 12 sons of Jacob and the 70 members of Jacob's family who originally resided in Egypt. Now, what the Israelites don't realize yet is that the desert is going to become something like God's training ground for them. So cue the Rocky training montage music, because they don't really know what it means to be the people of God yet. And before I go any further in the story, let me just say that when we read the Gospels in the New Testament, we see the authors there paralleling a lot of what happens in Jesus' life with this same story in Exodus. The Israelites prepare the Passover lamb to be protected from death. Jesus becomes the proverbial Passover lamb to everyone to ultimately protect us from death. Moses leads the Israelites to freedom from enslavement in Egypt. Jesus then leads us to freedom from enslavement of sin. The Israelites go into the desert to learn to better hear God. Jesus goes into the desert before beginning his public ministry to train to better hear God. These parallels, they keep happening, and you're going to continue to see them more and more as we continue to learn more about the Old Testament. But after they spend some time at Elim, the Israelites, they enter into a new wilderness called Sin. Now, that's just the name of the region. It's not necessarily meant as a theological statement, although again, when Jesus goes into the wilderness, that's exactly what he's tempted with. Anyhow, the wilderness of Sin transitions into a more mountainous region. Shur's a relatively flat area, but the wilderness of Sin eventually takes them back to Mount Sinai, otherwise known as Mount Oreb. And you remember that God told Moses at the burning bush in chapter 3, verse 12, that that God would lead the Israelites to Sinai as a sign of faithfulness to them. That's where they'd worship God. So back into the wilderness they go, and about 45 days into this whole adventure, the Israelites, they start losing faith again, and they all start complaining again to Moses in chapter 16, verse 2, essentially saying, if we had only died in Egypt with full bellies, but you've brought us into the wilderness to kill us with hunger. So dramatic. But then God tells Moses in verse 4 that he's going to test the Israelites to see whether they follow his instructions or not. So God is going to send them meat in the form of quail in the mornings and bread from heaven at night, which the Israelites come to call manna, which in the Bible it says it tasted like wafers made of honey. But God's also going to give them instructions all through chapter 16, which you can go read yourself, as to how they're to collect their food, how much to collect, how to prepare their food, when to eat their food. The Israelites are going to have to learn to follow God's ways. And what we read is that they mess up from time to time, but God, for example, in verse 27, even explains the rationale to the method that he's using for them. And then in verse 35, the scriptures tell us that the Israelites, they eat manna for 40 years until they finally came to the habitable land on the border of the land of Canaan. But it's not like this is just smooth sailing for 40 years. In chapter 17, we read that there's this time when they're traveling and there's no water to drink. And they start whining to Moses again in 17:3. Why'd you bring us out of Egypt? To kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? Moses is probably thinking, yeah, that's exactly why I brought you out here, to, free you from slavery, to watch you shrivel up and die a slow death. Moses has to be like, what is with these people? So Moses cries out to God and say, what shall I do with these people? They're about ready to stone me to death. So God tells Moses to take his staff and some of the elders of Israel and to go to a rock at Horeb and strike it, and water will come out. And so Moses does that, and sure enough, God provides water from the rock. So they call this place Massa, which means trial and temptation, and Meribah, which means quarrel or strife, because that was where the Israelites quarreled and tested the Lord, asking, is God among us or not? Remember, Jesus is God with us, right? These parallels keep continuing. And I think when we read these stories, there are numerous points, there are layers of this that we're trying to catch, that the authors are trying to put in front of us. But the one point that I want to make to you, to just emphasize today, is that when the Passover occurs and when God provides instructions so that God could easily identify who the people of God were, I think this wilderness training is kind of like that. It's helping the Israelites to build the identity of who they will be as the people of God. And what God is teaching them, and what God teaches us through these stories and the teachings of Jesus, is how to be formed into people who are trustworthy, and how to be formed into people who trust God. Because in this present life, without God, danger is just our norm. And our fear of danger, it keeps us from trusting others. I want you to think about this for a minute. Do you trust politicians? Do you trust journalists? Do you trust lawyers? Sorry, lawyers, I know we have some watching. Generally speaking, no. Why? Why don't you trust them? Because your general experience tells you that you shouldn't. We don't trust a lot of people anymore. And we don't trust people because we get hurt by them and then we fear getting hurt again. Lack of trust in a system is a lack of health. Let me say that again. Lack of trust in a system is a lack of health. But God gives us good news in this passage and says, I am the Lord who heals you. For us to be healed, we must come to trust God, and we must risk trusting each other so that we're reconciled. So we have to genuinely seek to treat each other well so that we can trust each other. So God uses this time that we read about in the desert to build trust with the Israelites. Don't worry about what you're going to eat. I got you. Just like God uses ministry in our church to help us to learn to trust God and to risk trusting each other. And when we develop that trust of God and one another, when we work at it by being faithful to God and to one another, by doing what we say we will do, and by showing up for one another, and by doing what's right, in a very real way, we become healed of our trust issues and a whole bunch of other issues along with them. Jesus knew this too. Jesus knows that ministry moves at the speed of trust. It's always amazed me that people wonder why the church in America struggles to grow. It's not because we somehow lack what people need. I was just thinking about this the other day. The church in many places is the only place in people's lives where they can safely engage with other people. For kids and youth especially, school is brutal for a lot of kids. Talk to middle school kids. Bullying, peer pressure to do things that are bad for them, the stratification of kids into stereotypes that's forced upon them. It's terrible. The internet, it's often not a lot better. Sometimes it's worse for them and for us. The church, though, at its best, following the teachings of Jesus, it provides a safe place for kids and youth and all people. So when people wonder why the church in America struggles to grow, it's not because we lack what people need. It's because we've lost the trust of the people. I just want to say, I'm really proud of the people at First Miami because I know how many of you are at the church or involved, either with us online or in person. And you're involved with us because you deeply believe that the world can be better, that humanity can be better, that the church can be better, and that we can be better. Hear me when I say to you, please keep going, because you're doing great. The world needs the church, a church it can trust, a church that trusts God. Let us be that church for the world. In the name of the Creator and the Redeemer and the Holy Spirit. Amen.